Hi, thanks for watching Table Talks today. I'm Adam C., the lead pastor at Orange United Methodist Church.
And I'm Kori Robbins, the associate pastor here at Orange. And this morning we are very excited. We have two amazing guests, incredibly smart people who've both been formative in my education and in my theological training. And the first I'd like to introduce you to is Dr. Sujin Pak. Sujin is the associate professor of the history of Christianity at Duke Divinity School, Duke University, and also the vice dean of academic affairs there. And Sujin, or Dean Pak, Dr. Pak, we'll call you Dr. Pak today. I know Dr. Pak not only as my professor, but also was blessed to work with her for 3 years at Duke Divinity School, and she was my dean then. So I am excited to have her join us. She is a specialist in the history of Christianity in late medieval and early modern Europe, and she focuses on the theology of Protestant reformers and the Protestant Reformation. And the Jews, women, and the Reformation is an interest of hers, as well as the history of biblical interpretation. She's published even a book entitled Can you say it for me, Dr. Pak?
Judaizing Calvin?
Yes, Calvin.
More recently, Reformation of Prophecy.
In Reformation Prophecy. So we are so excited. Welcome, Dr. Pak. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We're also joined by someone that I got to know over 20 years ago as a professor at Duke Divinity School, Dr. Grant Wacker. He was my professor for American Christianity, and one of my favorite professors, lecturers during that time when I was there, and I gave so much thanks for that. And when I became the pastor at Orange, I found out that Dr. Wacker was a part of this congregation, and I was so intimidated. But what I've grown to learn is he is not only wise and knowledgeable, but he's also a great friend. That I look forward to the opportunities, Grant, that you and I might be able to have to share, meet up for breakfast once again when this is all over. But just so that people are fully aware, I have right beside me Dr. Wacker's most recent publication, One Soul at a Time, as he tells the stories of Billy Graham, and he is a Graham expert. And so it's been so neat to hear some of those tidbits about the life of Billy Graham and all the ways that we might be able to learn from him and his life. But so we're grateful to have these two fantastic church historians a part of this conversation today. And where this came out of was several weeks ago, I had emailed Grant and asked him about what can the church learn about our past, our history, as we look at our current circumstances. And so I'll throw that question out there to y'all. As we look back at our past, what can we learn about our current circumstances?
Go ahead, Grant.
We have faced calamities in the past. That's the sum of it. And by we, I mean Americans in general and American Christians in particular. And we have not only survived them, but I think that on the whole, the church has prospered. Not only survived, as I say, but even thrived. Not always. The key word there is on the whole. There have been some really, really rough patches, but specific parts of the Christian church, and by that I mean Christians in general, have known how to use those times to strengthen themselves. I would add that I don't think that history gives us any tools for predicting the future. None whatsoever. Historians have probably they have a worse track record for predicting the future than anyone else because we think we can and we can't. And so we had no idea about this pandemic, and so that isn't what history does for us, but what history does do is give us perspective and equanimity and faith, faith that God reigns. And I think that those tools then enable us to deal with the crises when they come.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that history can teach us both examples of faithfulness and also examples of unfaithfulness. So as Christians have struggled with crises or, plagues in the past or major disruptions of their lives, we can see patterns in which Christians have been amazingly faithful and really witness to the truth and reality of a God who is loving and just, of a God who teaches love of neighbor, that love of neighbor is just as equal to love of God. And the fact that in order to really love God, you must love your neighbor. And so you can see those kind of acts of profound faithfulness, profound courage, and just a recognition, like in this wake of a plague, like in the past and then in the present, that death is not the last answer. And so Christians are a resurrection people who know that not that you were just think of otherworldly, this is about this world too, and about faithfulness in this world, but also that death is not the last word, but that life is always the last word of God. But at the same time, we have to pay attention to the fact that there's been times when we haven't exactly lived into faithfulness as I think we should. Crises bring out the best and worst of people, and humans are human. And so as humans, we also have both the best and the worst. And so some of the worst things that can happen that we need to look at and avoid is sort of demonizing, or sometimes the most marginal people get blamed. And sometimes you see the exacerbation between the rich and the poor. And we've struggled with that just as any humans have. For instance, when the bubonic plague was happening in the 14th century, many Christians actually blamed the Jews for the plague and argued that they poisoned the wells. And then we see several massacres of Jews. So there's always this need to scapegoat or find an answer or figure out to blame. And so we need to be very careful about those kinds of patterns and remember our higher calling of love of neighbor, our higher calling of promoting life for all.
Yes, I'll add there that I think Sujin's words could have been taken from 1 Corinthians, actually. And exactly, I agree, totally.
And Sujin, I think that's a really great example that you used, and we're wondering if you could both maybe talk about what periods of crisis or transition that the church has endured, that has faced, that has required people to radically alter their behavior and their lives, and how did the church respond?
Yeah. So if you want to talk specifically about plague, there's been seasons of that, and then I can also talk more generally. There was a plague in the 2nd century called the Antonine Plague. There was a plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century, another plague of Justinian in the 6th century. The earlier ones were probably smallpox. The other one is sort of Ebola-like, and then the Justinian plague was the first case of bubonic plague that we know of. And then the bubonic plague, which is also called the Black Death because of the black pustules that would develop on people's bodies. That was in the 1347 to 52. And then we've also got the Spanish flu in 1918-19. And so what's interesting, historian Rodney Stark argued that in the earlier plagues, it actually helped with the witness of Christianity, because Christians were profoundly different than the ways their typical neighbors acted. Instead of fleeing or just trying to just protect themselves, they really, really cared for not only their own fellow Christians, but for their neighbors. And so some historians will argue that in those first centuries that the Christian response to the disease was actually something that promoted conversion to Christianity, because they saw how loving the communities were, and they actually had a lower death rate. Now you can, theorize, that because they were caring for their people, that helped actually keep from people from dying. Some people might argue that God was with them. Anything could be possible, right? In terms of protection. More broadly, I would, we've had, a number of crises from, strife within the church in terms of like figuring out our own theology, but I would say, like things like a climate shift in medieval times where society shifted from an agricultural society to an urban society. That was a radical change. And then kind of you had to rethink how you did church, and you had to rethink you know, what preaching was like then. You see the rise of street preachers and city preachers, and you see a change in sort of monastic living, which is not just out in the countryside, but then you have these sort of houses in the cities. Another big radical shift would have been the rise of science, and sort of how do we then view our world as we learn more about science. And you can see the typical patterns of a very conservative reaction to a more liberal reaction in which you use the new learning to rethink how you are Christian, to moderate reactions, which both try to hold to tradition and also understand that all knowledge belongs to God. And then likewise, rise of enlightenment, where you have challenges to scriptural authority, challenges to whether God even exists. And again, you see those kind of spectrum of reactions from conservative, sort of like we're going to hold absolutely to our belief and not change them, to liberal, we're going to use the new knowledge to adapt, to a moderate, to say we're going to try to keep to our core convictions, but also recognize that all knowledge belongs to God. So I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll see what Grant has to say to that question.
Okay, I will talk about 3 events in the past. I could talk for hours, which would be a calamity in itself if I did that. But 3 different kinds of events, and the aim is to put it in perspective that we have suffered, and there have been grievous times. The first that comes to mind is the enormity, in precise sense of that word, the direness of what took place during the American Civil War. And when I tell students about it today, they are astounded because we've kind of occluded that part of our history. To give just a couple of examples, well, the first and main thing is just the carnage. At least 700,000 men, mostly men, died on the battlefield. And if we translate that into today's population, that would be the equivalent of 7 million slain on the battlefield. There are other ways of getting at that. That's only battle deaths. If we think about civilian deaths, which would be preponderantly women and children and African Americans. African Americans didn't really join the war until very close to the end. But if we think of those other units, it's easily over 2 million people died as a result of the Civil War. Place that in comparative perspective, that's something like 14 million people dying today. You just think of the magnitude of the shock. Another way to think about it is that in the South, every 4th white household suffered a fatality. Think about your own block where you grew up. Every 4th house, someone died. One more way to think about it, if we translate these figures into today's population, it would have been as if there was a 9/11 every single day for 4 years. So we began to get a sense of just the magnitude of the carnage that took place. The second is medical. Sujin's already referred to it, and that would be the Spanish flu, influenza of 1918, 1919. 675,000 Americans alone died. Some people say, Sujin know more about this than I, but some people say at least 50 million worldwide, but 675,000 Americans died. We often think about World War I as a crucial killing event, which it was. About 110,000 men, mostly men, died. World War I ended in November of 1917. The following year, in 1919, 7 times as many people died. And again, it fell preponderantly on women as caretakers, and as Sujin said, those who are marginalized. The third that I would mention is economic. First is military, second medical, and the third is economic. And this would be the Great Depression. My grandparents lived through it, all 4 of them, and I grew up hearing about the Great Depression. This ran from about 1932 to 1936, 38. And there again, the figures are just staggering. I took a minute to check them out. And By 1933, there were 15 million unemployed, which again, if we translate that into current population figures, it would be something like 25% of the workforce was unemployed in 1933. Half of the banks failed. The nation's industrial production, the GNP, fell by 50%. One more point that we often forget is the drought, which had nothing to do with economics, but it took place in 33 and 34, and hundreds of thousands of people, especially in the South, were driven out. So I could go on, but the point is there have been calamities of all sorts.
Some of those numbers are just staggering to
Right.
think through, and especially when we look at our current circumstances and hearing on the news about how unemployment is reaching levels of the Great Depression. But when we take it into consideration, the population growth.
Right. Right.
We
I
hear,
mean, you go in the Civil War period, the population was 31 million. Today it's 330 million. And so what we need to do is think about the proportional shock to the system, and then the despair and fear that generates.
well, and I guess for us as a church today, when we look back at those kind of times, what did those times of crisis, how did that impact the relationship between the church and its congregants, or the church and even the community? I think about with the Great Depression, if people are so impoverished, how could the church survive through such periods? How did the church interact with the congregants and its communities during different times of either plague or war or any of that?
I mean, I can speak more to the U.S. context, but I think one thing I think that when I teach church history, I realize there's things that I should include that I just forget to include. For example, in the early modern period, the church was a leader of founding hospitals, and the church was a leader in founding systems of social welfare. Like they had a profound conviction, like an Acts church conviction. The book of Acts church conviction, that you're supposed to care for everyone, that you're supposed to share all goods, and there really shouldn't be this huge gap between rich and poor. And so the church was, at least in the early modern period, the ones that built these hospitals. In the time of Martin Luther, when there was a resurgence of plague, his own home became a hospital. And they advocated, they had enough knowledge of science to realize that there's starting to begin a beginning sense of germ theory, and a sense that contagion and how things are spread, and the need for hygiene and need for a separated place and sanitary places. And so they founded these hospitals. And so there's those kind of practical things that in fact the church exactly had a hand in, and more broadly, maybe not exactly on point, but the church was the one that started free public education, which made a huge difference for millions of lives. I'd say it's also just a place of hope to remind people of pastoral care, and hope of giving a place for recognizing despair is not the last word. A place of just providing for not just pastoral needs, but also the holistic needs of the body, and taking in the poor, the widow, the orphan, etc.
Would you like me to say a word about the American response? And actually, they were quite different in the three times that I have raised, the three periods. And I could say, we could have looked at a lot of different ones, a smallpox plague in Boston in 1690, and a yellow fever plague in Philadelphia in 1718. There are many, many others, but these three is sort of monster calamities is what I'll call it. And I'll follow Dean Pak in saying that in all of these periods, we see a precedent that I'm not proud of. As a Christian, as a Methodist, I'm not proud of. I lament them. But there are also great acts of nobility, and a lot of this actually we can see the same in the mission field. Some things we're not proud of, but some things we can be very proud of. So we'll take the Civil War example. On the downside, the most grievous event or part or stream or dimension of it is that Christians and Christian clergy in particular fomented the carnage. And we have ample evidence of the clergy in particular invoking God's blessing for both sides. And of course, in the South, beyond invoking God's blessings for defense of the South and the Confederate cause, it's also God's blessing for the system of enslavement. And the volume of sermons is just staggering. And they are not patriotic in the grand sense that we might think of as love of nation, but rather love of the military cause for which we fight, and God sanctions killing. One historian, Harry Stout, my counterpart at Yale, writes about the relentless, mindless fury of the killing, and preachers fueled it. On the other side, this is rather what Sujin was talking about, the church's involvement in hospitals, in nurses, ways of dealing with just the physical suffering. There were revivals on both sides, but especially in the South, Southern Civil War revivals. After the Civil War, again, we have the two sides. There's no question that the church was involved in the development of the Jim Crow system, where we abolished slavery, but reinstituted a kind of segregation that was extraordinary in American history. But at the same time, we see after the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, we see the insurgence of global missions, the growth of theological creativity. Denominations, as we know them, come into place. They start earlier, but they are actually formulated. So I think these are all very positive developments that come out of the Civil War era. Second one, with the flu of the 1918, actually, surprisingly, I see very little response of the church to that, except in the very important sense that particularly the more independent or evangelical or holiness groups, or Methodist holiness groups, played a role in soup kitchens and trying to provide the solace that they could. We think of Angelus Temple, for example, in Los Angeles, Amy Semple McPherson's church, which was stood out for distribution of food supplies in that period. But on the whole, I don't find anything distinctively different from the response to the epidemic. So we shouldn't always expect that we will find a distinctive response. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And what I find especially remarkable is I do not see the development of theodicy, as theologians call it, an explanation of how God could permit this. We just don't do that. And you would think this would be a period that would have been rich in theodicy, and it was not. The Great Depression, it's a little hard to talk about it because the Depression immediately led into World War II. And so the churches suffered economically across the board, like everyone. People just didn't have the money to sustain it. But because the Depression immediately led into World War II, and World War II brought us out of the Depression, then I think the appropriate place to look is at the revival of the 1950s. And there we find an extraordinary insurgence of all kinds, not the least is children. I'm a product of that generation, and children sweep into the Sunday schools. And so we see the insurgence of children. There's this economic power that had been pent up, and now it's suddenly released. And so church buildings everywhere. This is the era of the great revivals of Billy Graham, theological insurgence of Reinhold Niebuhr. So the 50s and 60s, I think we see the release of that kind of pent-up energy. I take heart from that when energies get dammed up for a while, they do get released. And then there is this efflorescence.
I think the church has always had a struggle in times of crisis. There can be a tendency to turn to apocalyptic thinking or in-world thinking. There's those kind of things that raise up.
Yeah.
And you can see the tensions of how the church has struggled with sort of this worldly life and otherworldly life. So you can see the extreme of sort of thinking we're in the end times and trying to use the Bible as a roadmap to read history, which has never really gone well, I would say. And I mean, I don't think the book of Revelation was meant as an absolute roadmap, since it's all metaphorical and allegorical, but not to say there's not truth. There's definitely truth there. It's just be careful to use it as a historical roadmap. And then, we've struggled with sort of like the extreme otherworldly, this world doesn't matter, so who cares about the slaughter, or who cares about the suffering, because we're looking for life and eternity on the other side, to trying to use scripture as a historical roadmap. And I think that my own opinion, and it is my opinion, that our faithfulness to me is always the hardest thing to do. It's finding that beautiful balance, walking that, narrow path, which means keeping your foot both in this world and with the kind of larger Christian hope of resurrection and eternal life, one foot in each world, which means I should never just assume or think it's just fine to see suffering because the Bible seemed to have predicted such suffering. Like I should never turn a blind eye to anyone's suffering. That should always break my heart. That should always call me to love a neighbor. And also that I know death is not the last word, that I know that God holds all things in God's hands, that I know there is an end of God's promised blessedness and goodness for which I can hold absolutely with hope and endure hardship. Nonetheless, but not to glory in the hardship, nor to turn a blind eye to suffering.
I'd like to spin off of a couple of words that Sujin used: break heart. One of the great philanthropic and missionary organizations of the last 50 years, last 70 years now, is World Vision International. And now one of the largest organizations of that sort in the world. The founder was Bob Pierce, eccentric man, interesting character in himself, but the founding vision of World Vision came from Bob Pierce's words. And he said, "Let the things that break God's heart break mine too." Mm-hmm. And I take that as marching orders. And I shared that with I co-taught a class with Sujin this semester, a great privilege. And I shared that several times with the class. Let the things that break God's heart break mine too. If I think about the long picture of American Christianity, the major downside, I speak of the major downside and the major upside. The single most grievous downside was how the clergy, through their moral influence behind the carnage of the war. There is so much evidence that the war could have ended 2 years sooner than it did, and hundreds of thousands of lives sooner than it did if it were not for the clergy constantly fueling it and saying, my cause is God's cause. So you can't argue. See, there's no political judgment here because it's God's cause, right? And so that's the downside and the most dangerous thing that's ever happened that the church has done. I think the upside, where I take great heart, is the surge of energy that we see in the 1950s. And of course, there was so much else that wasn't always good. But there was that surge of interest that began to bring about the civil rights movement, which was not, it didn't really come alive until the Civil Rights Acts of the mid 60s and Martin Luther King, but it's behind, it really gets moving. and global missions, the evangelical move in media efforts and outreach. And there, I think the notice or the word for us is how to channel. How do we channel our affluence? That was a period of unique prosperity in American history. So the question is, when we have these resources, how do we channel them rather than dissipate them, throw them around? There was a Scottish missionary named Andrew Walls, and he talked about American missions. And he said, when I think about American missions, I think about big boots in the temple. What a line, you see, the power that we have, that money buys power. Well, what it doesn't have to, what it can buy is the heart that is broken for the things that break God's heart.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm so grateful for both of you sharing so much of your wisdom and knowledge with us, as well as your time today. So thank you so much. Pastor Kori, any final questions or thoughts?
Just deep gratitude. And I studied history in undergrad, and so this is just, made my heart sing. I've so enjoyed just listening to both of you, and they're like captivated by just stories. And I think that's the most beautiful piece of history and the history of the church and even the scriptures, that we find ourselves in the stories of the past. And I think that can help inspire us for both what is right and what is wrong. So I just thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom and your faithful witness with us this morning.
Thank you, Kori.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Yes.
So once again, thank you so much for being a part of this, Dr. Pack, Dr. Wacker, and look forward to being able to reconnect another time in another way, possibly. But thank you also for everybody that has watched this and is a part of watching the table talks. And we're grateful for the ways that we can still connect in such times of unique circumstances. So thank you so much. Be blessed.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.